What if the quietest towns hide the darkest secrets? Welcome to Hollow Creek, a seemingly peaceful place where shadows whisper ancient curses and every step could lead you closer to a nightmare. When Emma arrives searching for answers about her family's past, she uncovers more than she bargained for: rituals, a haunting presence, and a legacy of terror that refuses to die. This is not just a story about ghosts, it's about facing the unimaginable fear lurking inside us all. Are you ready to confront the unknown? Because once you enter Hollow Creek, there's no turning back. There was something off about the silence in Fairvale, like the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to crawl out of the dark. The last stretch of Route 219 wound through the Appalachians like a serpent, its cracked asphalt cutting through dense thickets of pine and oak. Elijah Carver kept his eyes on the road, fingers tightening around the wheel of his rusty Ford Ranger as the needle of the fuel gauge dipped dangerously low. Fairvale was still 12 miles out. The GPS had stopped working an hour ago, frozen on a screen that simply read, "Searching for signal." He didn't need a signal, he had a mission. The letter crumpled in the glove compartment had no return address. Just a name, Martha Blevins, and a warning scribbled beneath it in shaky handwriting. "Don't let it wake again. Check the ledger." Elijah had nearly tossed it in the trash, another crackpot from one of the old local forums he used to moderate. But something about the postmark, Fairvale, Kentucky, a town that hadn't had a functioning post office since the 1970s, had stirred a long-buried memory. His father's voice, raspy and near delirious from morphine, had once whispered, "If the Blevins place ever calls, you go. You stop it." The Blevins place. It sat at the edge of Fairvale, half buried in fog and forgotten by most maps, a Victorian monstrosity, wrapped in kudzu and silence, and abandoned since the last Blevins died in 1972. Except the townsfolk claim they still saw candlelight flickering in the upper windows some nights. They never talked about it openly, but everyone knew. Something old lived there, something patient. Elijah pulled into Fairvale just as the sun began to sink behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the one-lane main street. The town looked like it had been embalmed. Store signs faded, windows boarded, an old church bell tower leaning slightly, its cross half snapped. A laundromat sat shuttered next to a diner where a neon sign blinked erratically. Opie, Opie, Opie. He parked beside a general store with a hand-painted sign. Miller's Mercantile, Est. 1924. The door creaked open with a protesting moan, and the scent of dust and mildew clung to the air. A hunched old man behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle. "Ain't had a visitor in 2 weeks, he said without prompting, voice like cracked leather. "Not since the fog came early." Elijah didn't bother with pleasantries. "You know the Blevins house?" The old man stiffened, his cloudy eyes narrowed. "Boy, the hell you want with that place?" "I'm here about Martha. Got a letter?" A pause, then a dry chuckle. "Ain't no Martha Blevins alive, not for 50 years. I know, but someone wrote me." A beat of silence passed between them, heavy as iron. "You staying up there?" the old man finally asked. Elijah nodded. The man scratched something on the crossword, muttered, "God help you," and slid a tin can across the counter. "Take this, salt. Don't forget the thresholds." The bell over the door jangled as Elijah left. By the time he reached the Blevins property, dusk had deepened into a thick purplish haze. The forest seemed to lean inward as he drove down the narrow gravel road, branches brushing against the windshield like fingers. The forest seemed to lean inward as he drove down the narrow gravel road, branches brushing against the windshield like Then abruptly the trees opened into a clearing. The house loomed ahead, 3 stories of warped gray wood, gables like sharp teeth, windows black as gouged eyes. He stepped out, salt canister in hand. The air was different here, still, but with a pressure that pressed against his ears, like being underwater. The porch steps groaned beneath his boots. He sprinkled salt across the doorway as the man had told him, then reached for the doorknob. It turned too easily. Inside, the house was colder than it should have been, even in October. Dust coated everything. but there was no smell of mold, just dry rot and something faintly metallic beneath it. The kind of smell you get in old churches and mausoleums. The front hallway was lined with peeling floral wallpaper and picture frames turned face down on the walls. A shattered mirror hung at an angle, a splinter of glass catching Elijah's eye and reflecting his face back in fractured slivers. He found the study on the first floor. Books strewn across the floor, paper brittle with age. One sat open on the desk, a leather-bound ledger, its pages covered in looping script. Elijah flipped to the marked page. April 23, 1949. The child screams again. The thing under the roots calls her name in dreams. We must not feed it this cycle. We must starve it back to sleep. Underneath, in red ink, do not disturb the burial mound, even in drought. His pulse quickened. A sound, soft, like someone whispering through burlap, came from upstairs. He froze. There shouldn't be anyone else here. He moved toward the staircase, each step on the worn wood sounding like thunder in the silence. The whispering grew louder as he reached the landing. Then it stopped. The hallway was lined with closed doors, all of them swollen with age and paint. One stood slightly ajar. Candlelight flickered inside. He approached, heart thudding. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The room was empty, save for a single candle burning on the floor and a circle of white stones laid around it. Inside the circle sat a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case, carved with sigils Elijah didn't recognize. On the wall behind it, someone had scrawled words in charcoal. Do not open. The roots remember. Elijah took one step inside the room. The candle extinguished on its own. The house moaned. Behind him, something began knocking, once, twice, 3 times, on the wall inside the hallway, as if from within the plaster. Elijah turned slowly. The knocking stopped, but the air had changed again, thicker, sour, and then he heard the whisper. Elijah. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it knew his name. Elijah's breath hung heavy in the cold, stale air as he stared at the empty room, the silence pressing in on him like a living thing. The whisper, soft but unmistakable, had slipped away, leaving only the creaking house and his own pounding heartbeat in the darkness. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but something stronger held him rooted. He glanced back at the doorway where the candle had just gone out, leaving the room bathed in shadows. His fingers trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the gloom. The circle of white stones glistened faintly under the beam, their surfaces smooth and cold. The wooden box sat at the center like a slumbering beast, its carved sigils pulsing with an eerie presence Elijah couldn't explain. He knelt slowly, careful not to disturb the stones, and ran his fingers over the box's surface. It was heavier than it looked. A sudden chill raced up his spine. The whisper came again, this time clearer, closer. Elijah! He jerked his head up, scanning the hallway beyond the room, but saw nothing but warped wallpaper and peeling paint. The air shifted, thickening like molasses. He forced himself to breathe slowly. Who's there? His voice cracked. No answer. Instead, a faint scratching sound came from the far corner of the room. Soft, irregular, like nails scraping wood. Elijah's flashlight flickered as his mind raced back to the ledger's warning. Do not disturb the burial mound, even in drought. His thoughts tumbled. What burial mound? What had they buried here, and why? With shaking hands, he set the box down outside the circle. As soon as the box left the protective ring, the scratching stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse, thick and heavy, as if the house was listening, waiting. Elijah's eyes darted to the small window where the last light of day had been swallowed by clouds rolling in fast. The wind picked up, rattling the panes with a mournful keening. Suddenly, the front door slammed downstairs, echoing through the empty house like a gunshot. His heart leapt. Who's there? He called, his voice steady but low. No response. He stood and grabbed a rusty iron poker leaning against the fireplace mantel, gripping it tightly as he descended the creaking stairs. The main hallway was dim, lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. The windows revealed the full weight of the approaching storm. Thick fog curling around the overgrown garden, swallowing the wrought iron gate and the twisted shapes of dead trees. Elijah moved toward the door, which swung open with a groan on its ancient hinges. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, sizzling on the cracked porch floor. He stepped out, the cold biting through his jacket. The storm was coming fast. As he surveyed the overgrown yard, a sudden flicker caught his eye. Something deep in the fog, a shadow moving too fluidly to be human. He squinted, raising his poker defensively. The shadow halted, then slipped behind an ancient oak with limbs like grasping claws. Elijah's skin prickled. He was not alone. "Show yourself," he demanded, voice loud enough to echo off the empty woods. Only silence answered. From the edge of his vision, a faint glow pulsed in the mist, the pale blue of a lantern's flame, wavering and unnatural. Compelled, Elijah stepped forward, feeling the weight of invisible eyes watching him. The grass beneath his boots was sodden and soft, and each step stirred the scent of damp earth and decay. The glow retreated slowly, leading him toward the back of the property where the forest pressed close, choking the horizon with blackened trunks. A sudden crack to his left made him whirl. A gnarled figure stood silhouetted between two trees. A woman, her dress torn, face pale and eyes reflecting the lantern light like deep wells. Elijah blinked, but she vanished, leaving only the faint echo of whispered words. "Help me. Stop it." The storm broke with a violent roar, rain pelting down in sheets as Elijah forced his way through the underbrush. The woman's voice tugged at him, guiding him toward the edge of the woods where tangled roots broke the soil. He stumbled into a clearing, dominated by a shallow mound covered in moss and wildflowers. The earth cracked and dry despite the rain. Kneeling beside it, Elijah felt a coldness seep from the ground, a malevolent pulse thumping beneath the soil. The whispered voice returned, chanting in a language he didn't understand, weaving through the patter of rain. His mind reeled back to the ledger's cryptic notes, the child screaming, the thing under the roots calling her name in dreams. A sudden movement behind him made Elijah spin, poker raised. The old man from the mercantile appeared, soaked to the bone, eyes wild. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed. "You'll wake it." Elijah lowered the poker cautiously. "I have to stop it," the letter said. "The letter?" The man's gaze darkened. "They've been sending those for decades, trickling out like poison." "What is it?" Elijah pressed. The old man spat onto the ground, a curse, older than any of us. "The roots that bind Fairvale aren't just trees, they're prisons. They hold something ancient, something hungry." Elijah swallowed hard. "And the child?" "Sacrifice. Every generation they try to keep the hunger at bay, but the last time they failed." The man's eyes flicked back toward the mound. "And now you're here." Before Elijah could respond, a guttural sound erupted from beneath the earth, a wet dragging noise like claws scraping stone. The ground trembled slightly. From the shadows a low, agonized wail echoed, piercing the storm. The old man grabbed Elijah's arm. "Run, before it breaks free." Elijah hesitated, torn between flight and the pull of the mystery. Then the mound cracked, a jagged fissure yawned wide, releasing a fetid breath like death itself. Something ancient stirred below. Elijah's flashlight flickered and died. Darkness swallowed him whole. The wind howled through the skeletal trees surrounding Hollow Creek, whispering secrets that seemed too old to be remembered. Emma sat on the edge of the cracked wooden porch, clutching a worn journal she had found in the attic. Each page was stained with age, scrawled in hurried, shaky handwriting. The entries spoke of strange happenings, rituals performed in the dead of night, voices carried on the wind, and a shadow that never left the town. But what haunted Emma most was the mention of the gathering, a secretive event tied to the curse that had plagued her family for generations. Despite the chill creeping through her bones, Emma forced herself to read on, desperate for answers. The deeper she delved, the heavier the atmosphere grew, as if the house itself was breathing alongside her, watching, waiting. Outside, faint echoes drifted from the dense forest. The same eerie whispers her grandmother had warned her about. They weren't just stories. There was something real, something ancient stirring beneath the surface of this quiet town. Determined to uncover the truth, Emma ventured down the rutted dirt road toward the local library, a relic from another era with peeling paint and dusty windows. The librarian, a gaunt woman named Mrs. Caldwell, eyed her curiously, but soon softened when Emma explained her connection to Hollow Creek. Together, they sifted through old newspapers and faded town records, revealing a disturbing pattern. Every few decades, residents vanished without explanation, their disappearances coinciding with unsettling celestial events. Emma's mind reeled as she pieced together fragmented tales of a secret society, the Keepers, who maintained the balance between the living and the darkness lurking in the woods. Legends spoke of sacrifices and blood rites designed to appease an unholy presence. The air in the library seemed to thicken with each revelation, the shadows lengthening as if reaching for the truths buried within these brittle pages. Returning home, Emma couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her every step felt measured, the silence pressing down like a weight. That night, a piercing scream shattered the stillness, echoing from the depths of the forest. She grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound, heart pounding wildly. The beam caught glimpses of twisted branches and fleeting shadows that darted just beyond her vision. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath her feet, and she tumbled into a hidden cellar, a long-forgotten crypt adorned with strange symbols and faded bloodstains. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something more sinister. Amid the gloom, a weathered altar stood at the center, encircled by candles melted to stubs. Scrawled on the walls were warnings in a language Emma couldn't decipher, but the ominous feeling was unmistakable. Her fingers brushed against a worn amulet lying atop the altar, cold and heavy, pulsing faintly with an energy that made her skin crawl. As she grasped it, a sudden chill surged through her, and the whispers from the forest returned, louder and more urgent than ever. Emma knew she had crossed a threshold, one from which there was no turning back. Back in the safety of her room, the amulet burned against her skin, a relentless reminder of the darkness entwined with her bloodline. The journal's final entry flashed in her mind. The curse awakens anew. The shadow seeks what was lost. Emma's resolve hardened. She was no longer just a visitor in Hollow Creek. She was part of the story, bound by a legacy she could neither escape nor deny. But as the night deepened, a sinister presence stirred beyond her window, watching, waiting for her next move. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the small town of Fairvale, wrapping the empty streets and shuttered storefronts in a suffocating silence. Elijah woke to the distant tolling of the church bell, its mournful clang resonating like a funeral dirge through the cold air. The storm from the night before had passed, but its shadows lingered, dark and heavy, seeping into every corner of the town's cracked sidewalks and peeling paint. He sat on the edge of the creaking bed in his rented room above the general store, his fingers still trembling from the night's terror. The memory of the earth splitting beneath the mound haunted him, the sickening sound of stone scraping stone, the breath of rot and decay that had poured from the fissure, and that wail, a sound not meant for human ears. He had to understand what he was facing. After dressing, Elijah made his way down the narrow staircase to the storefront below. The mercantile was barely awake. The old man who had warned him last night was already behind the counter, polishing a worn wooden box with a rag that looked as ancient as the store itself. His eyes flicked toward Elijah as he entered, dark and haunted. "We don't get many visitors this time of year," the man grunted without looking up. Elijah swallowed his unease. "I need to know more about this curse, about the sacrifices, about the roots." The old man's hand stilled. He finally looked up, meeting Elijah's gaze with something that resembled pity. "You're stirring things that were meant to stay buried. I don't have a choice." Elijah's voice was firm. "People keep disappearing. Children. Something is wrong." The man sighed, motioning toward a dusty shelf lined with yellowed books and brittle papers. "Look through these. History, folklore, all the stories the town tried to forget. But be careful. The more you know, the heavier the burden." Elijah picked up a fragile ledger, its spine cracked in pages fragile as autumn leaves. As he leafed through, the words painted a grim history. Fairvale had been built on land once sacred to a native tribe, the Ashiwi, whose people vanished mysteriously long ago. Their burial grounds lay beneath the town, disturbed and forgotten. The roots beneath Fairvale weren't just trees, they were the tendrils of a curse born from blood and betrayal. He found a passage about the hunger beneath, an ancient entity said to dwell beneath the soil, sealed away by rituals long lost to time. Every generation, a child was taken as a sacrifice to keep it dormant. But the rituals had faltered, and the entity's hunger was growing. The ledger's ink smudged as Elijah's fingers brushed the page. A note scrawled in shaky handwriting caught his eye. The roots whisper names in the dark. Beware the voices that call. A sudden chill swept the room, despite the warmth of morning sun filtering through dusty windows. Elijah closed the book and looked up. The old man was watching him with narrowed eyes. They say the Ashiwi spirits still walk here, bound to protect the land or curse it. Some say the whispers come from them, warning or deceiving. The man's voice dropped to a whisper. You won't find peace until you face what's beneath. Outside, the town was waking, but the usual bustle was missing. Doors remained shut, and the occasional glance from shadowed windows felt like a silent plea or a warning. Elijah stepped out, the ledger tucked under his arm, and headed toward the sheriff's office. He needed official records, anything that might shed light on the disappearances. The sheriff, a grizzled woman named Marlene, greeted him with cautious eyes. The sheriff's office was cluttered, filled with stacks of reports and photographs that told stories of faded smiles and vanished lives. Elijah placed the ledger on her desk. I'm trying to understand what's happening. These disappearances, do you think there's something else involved? Marlene looked away for a moment, then back. There are stories, whispered things. Town elders say the forest watches, that some roots should never be disturbed. But official reports, nothing concrete. But you believe them. The sheriff sighed, fingers tightening on a faded photograph of a missing girl. I believe there's more than we understand, something old, something hungry. Elijah felt a weight settle on his chest. The veil of normalcy was thinner than he'd thought. Later he wandered the edge of the forest bordering Fairvale, where twisted trees leaned like sentinels over tangled roots that clawed at the earth. The rain from the storm had soaked the soil, and the air was thick with the scent of moss and rot. He paused near the base of an ancient oak, recalling the mound from the night before. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper curled on the wind, a voice soft and sorrowful, carrying a name he couldn't quite catch. Suddenly, the ground beneath him shifted. A root, thick and gnarled, broke the surface, twisting like a serpent. Elijah stumbled back, heart hammering. In the distance, a child's laughter echoed, sharp and hollow. Elijah spun around, scanning the trees. The laughter faded, replaced by the creeping silence of the forest. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small talisman given to him by the old man, a simple carved wooden charm said to protect against evil spirits. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the forest floor, Elijah felt eyes watching him from the darkness. Shapes moved just beyond sight, flickers of movement in the corner of his vision. He pressed forward, drawn by the need to unravel the curse, even as dread coiled in his gut. Back in town, the whispers spread like wildfire. Doors creaked, windows rattled, and unseen footsteps pattered through empty halls. That night, as Elijah lay in his room, a cold breath brushed his neck. The whisper returned, clearer now. Elijah, come home. His blood ran cold. The candle on the bedside flickered and died. The shadows in the corner twisted, growing longer, reaching out. The last thing Elijah saw before darkness swallowed him was a pale, ghostly hand beckoning from the gloom. The moment Elijah's eyes snapped open, the cold had already seeped into his bones, wrapping him in a shroud of dread that no blanket could chase away. Outside, the sky was bruised purple and gray, the early morning light struggling to push back the lingering shadows. But inside the rented room above the general store, the darkness clung thick and suffocating, as if the night itself had taken root in the corners. He lay still for a long moment, listening. The silence was broken only by the faint creak of old wood settling, or perhaps something else, a whisper, a breath, a secret too faint to grasp fully. Then it came again, sharper this time, a low murmur threading through the still air. "Elijah?" The voice was soft, but it carried a weight that pressed down on his chest. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet touching the cold wooden floor. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee this town and its haunted secrets, but the puzzle was unfinished. The roots of the curse had only just begun to show their deadly tendrils, and he was trapped in a twisted web of history, loss, and dark hunger. Pulling on his jacket, Elijah moved toward the window. The streets of Fairvale lay empty, the fog weaving through the skeletal branches of trees that lined the sidewalks. The church steeple pierced the morning haze, a silent witness to centuries of whispered prayers and bloodied rites. He grabbed his coat and the worn ledger from the table. Today he would follow the trail deeper into the town's past, into the archives, the forgotten tales, and the murky shadows of memory. The Historical Society building was an aging brick structure, perched at the edge of Fairvale's town square. Its heavy oak doors creaked in protest as Elijah pushed them open, stepping inside the dimly lit room where dust motes danced in beams of fractured sunlight. The scent of old paper and fading ink hung thick in the air, a palpable weight of years pressing down on every shelf. Behind the front desk sat Mrs. Caldwell, a sharp-eyed woman with silver-streaked hair and a demeanor both kind and wary. Her fingers paused over a stack of documents as Elijah approached. "I hear you're asking questions about the old curse," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not many do these days." Elijah nodded. "I need to know everything. The history, the rituals, the sacrifices, whatever you have." She sighed and led him to a back room where yellowed newspapers, faded photographs, and brittle manuscripts were carefully stored. Fairvale's past is tangled in stories no one wanted to remember. You must tread carefully. Spreading out a collection of documents, she began pointing out entries that told of strange disappearances dating back over a century. Each account mentioned eerie phenomena, children vanishing without a trace, shadows lurking at the edge of vision, and the ever-present whisper of the forest. One photograph captured Elijah's attention, a black and white image of a group of townsfolk standing before a gnarled oak tree. Their faces were somber, eyes haunted, as if they bore the weight of unspeakable knowledge. A crude wooden effigy hung from the tree's lowest branch, a symbol he recognized from the ledger's illustrations. "They called it the guardian root," Mrs. Caldwell explained. "A talisman meant to hold the curse at bay, but the rituals faded, and so did the protection." Elijah traced the carving with his finger, feeling the roughness beneath the aged paper. "Where did the rituals stop?" "Fear and forgetfulness," she replied. "Some believe the curse was just superstition. Others wanted to hide the truth. But the entity beneath the roots is real and hungry." The afternoon light waned as Elijah left the Historical Society, clutching the documents tightly. He made his way back toward the outskirts of town, where the forest swallowed the horizon in a wall of twisted branches and shadow. The air grew colder, heavier, as he stepped beneath the canopy. The ground was littered with fallen leaves, damp and decaying, and the silence was punctuated only by the distant call of a crow. With every step, Elijah's unease deepened. The trees seemed to lean closer, their roots tangled like veins just beneath the surface, pulsing with dark life. He remembered the warnings, the voices, the sacrifices, the hunger, and the faces of the missing children flickered in his mind, innocent and terrified. Deeper in the woods, he stumbled upon a clearing, bathed in fading light. At its center, a ring of stones encircled a pit covered with a lattice of roots. Elijah knelt beside it, brushing away leaves to reveal ancient symbols carved into the stones, glyphs that matched those in the ledger, etched with a precision that spoke of ritual and reverence. As he leaned closer, A sudden movement caught his eye, a flicker in the shadows beyond the clearing. His breath hitched. "Who's there?" he called out, voice trembling. Only silence answered. Then, faintly, the whisper came again. "Come to us." Elijah's heart thundered as the air turned icy. The roots at the edge of the clearing writhed, twisting as if alive. From the shadows emerged a figure, a child, pale and ethereal, eyes glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Elijah froze, torn between fear and an overwhelming sorrow that radiated from the apparition. "You don't belong here," the child whispered. "But you're part of the roots now." Before he could react, the ground trembled violently beneath him. The pit cracked open wider, releasing a fetid breath of earth and rot. Elijah stumbled backward, barely escaping the grasping tendrils that shot out like serpents, desperate to drag him into the darkness. Scrambling to his feet, he ran, branches clawing at his jacket, roots reaching like hands to snatch him back. Behind him, the voice echoed, a chorus of whispers rising into a chilling crescendo. "The hunger comes, the hunger takes." Emerging from the forest's edge, Elijah collapsed against a weathered fence post, gasping for breath. His mind reeled with the weight of what he had seen: the spectral child, the living roots, the ancient evil stirring beneath Fairvale. He pulled out the talisman from his pocket, gripping it tightly as if it might anchor him to the world of the living. But the curse was no longer content to remain buried. Back in his room, as twilight bled into night, Elijah's thoughts churned. The pieces were coming together, but the picture was darker than he could have imagined. The roots beneath Fairvale were not merely a natural phenomenon. They were a living prison, holding something ancient and malevolent. His phone buzzed suddenly, jolting him from his reverie. A message flashed on the screen from an unknown number. "They're watching. You're next." A cold sweat broke across his skin. Outside, the wind howled through the town's empty streets, carrying with it the whispered warnings of the past and the promise of horrors yet to come. Elijah didn't sleep that night. The talisman in his pocket felt heavier than ever, as if it absorbed the weight of the dread gnawing at his mind. He sat by the cracked window of his rented room, watching the fog roll in thick waves, swallowing the edges of Fairvale like a slow, suffocating tide. Somewhere deep in the distance, the tolling of the old church bell marked midnight, each echo a reminder of time running out. His fingers trembled as he flipped through the brittle pages of the ledger, searching for any clue that might explain the chilling encounter in the forest. The spectral child's words haunted him. "You're part of the roots now." What did that mean? Was he somehow connected to this curse? The thought was unbearable. Elijah had to know more. He recalled an old tale Miss Caldwell had mentioned about a ritual buried deep in Fairvale's history, one meant to imprison the dark entity beneath the roots. But if the ritual was forgotten or broken, maybe that was why the curse had grown stronger, feeding on fear and despair. Determined, Elijah grabbed his coat and headed back to the library before dawn. The musty smell of old books greeted him like an old friend, but his mind was a storm of urgency and fear. He scoured the archives, poring over town records, church logs, and faded diaries. Each document was a thread weaving a tapestry of sorrow and violence. Stories of families torn apart, whispered accusations of witchcraft, and sacrifices made in desperation. One entry stood out. Dated nearly 100 years ago, it told of a night of the hollow moon, when the townsfolk had gathered to perform a forbidden ritual beneath the ancient oak. They had bound themselves with oaths, using talismans carved from the tree's roots to seal the entity deep underground. But the price had been steep. A child was taken every year to maintain the bond, an unspoken pact sealed in blood. Elijah's heart pounded. Could this be why the disappearances had never stopped? Why the whispers of hungry roots and ghostly children lingered in the town's shadows? The truth was darker than he had imagined. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock on the library door. Elijah froze, eyes darting to the entrance. The librarian, a stoic man named Carter, stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. "You shouldn't be digging into this," Carter warned quietly. "There are things better left buried." "I have to," Elijah replied. voice steady despite the fear curling in his chest. "If I don't understand it, no one will stop it." Carter hesitated, then pulled a thin envelope from his coat pocket. "Take this. It belonged to my grandfather. He was part of that night. Maybe it'll help you." Elijah opened the envelope carefully. Inside were faded photographs and a small, crumbling journal filled with cryptic notes and sketches of the oak tree, the talismans, and strange symbols. As he flipped through the journal, a cold draft swept through the room. The lights flickered. Elijah's skin prickled with the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Later that evening, Elijah returned to the clearing where the pit lay hidden beneath the roots. The air was thick with damp earth and decaying leaves, but tonight there was something new, an unnatural stillness that pressed down like a weight on his chest. He knelt by the stone ring, running his fingers over the ancient glyphs, trying to memorize the shapes. He set the talisman down carefully, hoping it might strengthen the fading barrier between their world and the darkness beneath. Suddenly, the ground shuddered. From the shadows at the forest's edge, figures emerged, silhouettes of townsfolk long gone, their faces twisted in anguish, eyes hollow and accusing. Elijah's breath caught in his throat as ghostly voices rose in a mournful chorus, chanting in a language older than Fairvale itself. The pact must be honored, the hunger fed. Elijah scrambled backward, heart hammering as roots erupted from the soil like serpents, writhing toward him with malevolent intent. The ground cracked open wider, revealing a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He grabbed the talisman, clutching it to his chest as the shadows closed in. The cold whispered promises of oblivion, but Elijah forced himself to stand his ground. "This ends tonight," he vowed. From the depths of the pit, a low growl rose, a sound like the earth itself was waking, hungry for vengeance. The spectral child appeared again, eyes blazing with sorrow and fury. "You cannot break the roots," the ghostly figure warned. "They bind us all, living and dead." Elijah took a step forward, voice unwavering despite the fear choking his throat. "Then I will bind them again. I will finish what was started." As he prepared to perform the ritual inscribed in the journal, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The talisman grew warm in his palm, pulsing with an ancient energy. But before Elijah could begin, a sudden crack echoed through the trees, a snapping of branches, and a figure burst from the darkness. It was Carter. "Stop!" he shouted, eyes wild with desperation. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Elijah turned sharply, heart racing. "What do you mean?" he demanded. Carter's gaze flicked nervously over the pit, then back to Elijah. "The ritual, it's not just a seal, it's a curse. Every time you try to undo it, the roots grow stronger, the hunger deepens." A cold realization settled over Elijah like a shroud. This was no simple battle between good and evil. It was a cycle, endless and merciless. Suddenly, the earth trembled again. The roots tightened like a noose, and the ghostly children's cries crescendoed into a haunting wail that pierced the night. Elijah's vision blurred as the forest closed in, swallowing sound and light. And then, silence. He woke hours later, alone on the forest floor, the talisman shattered beside him. The moon hung low, casting long shadows that danced like specters. The hunger had not been sated. Elijah pulled himself to his feet, breath ragged. Somewhere deep inside, the roots pulsed, alive and waiting. But alive and waiting. As he stumbled back toward town, a whisper floated on the wind, a voice not his own. "The roots remember, and so shall you." The curse was far from over. The night air in Fairvale was thick with an unsettling stillness that seemed to press against the walls of every house, seeping into the bones of the town itself. Elijah could feel it crawling beneath his skin, a cold pulse of something ancient and hungry that refused to be ignored. The forest had swallowed him whole, but its grip was far from over. He sat in the dim light of the local diner, the worn linoleum floor creaking beneath his feet as the clock ticked toward midnight. The room was nearly empty, save for a few tired townsfolk nursing their coffees, their faces etched with the same quiet dread Elijah now carried. The weight of what he had witnessed, the shattered talisman, the spectral children, the relentless roots, settled deep in his mind, refusing to loosen its hold. Across from him, Sheriff Collins leaned forward, his eyes darkened by sleepless nights and the burden of secrets long kept. "You shouldn't have gone back out there," he said quietly. "The force doesn't just hunger for the body, it's after the soul." Elijah nodded, swallowing the bitter taste of fear. "I don't have a choice. This curse, it's tied to this town, to the people who lived here long before us. If it's not stopped, it will consume everything." Collins sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of generations. "The legends say the roots are the veins of something older than time itself. They bind the past to the present, and the present to a darkness that no one fully understands." Elijah's fingers brushed against the jagged edge of a new talisman he had fashioned from the remains of the broken one. It was imperfect, but it was all he had left to fight with. That night, he returned to the heart of the forest, to the clearing where the ancient oak stood sentinel over the earth's secrets. The moon hung low, its silver light casting elongated shadows that danced like phantoms among the twisted branches. Elijah's breath came in shallow bursts as he prepared the ritual, his hands trembling with a mix of hope and despair. The air thickened, and whispers, soft and fragmented, slithered through the trees. They spoke of pain, of betrayal, of blood spilled to keep the darkness sealed. Elijah traced the symbols carved into the earth, murmuring the incantations from the crumbling journal. With every word, the forest seemed to lean closer, watching, waiting. Suddenly, the ground quaked violently. Roots burst forth like serpents, writhing and twisting with unnatural strength. From the darkness, shadowy figures emerged, faces familiar, yet distorted by sorrow and rage. They reached for Elijah, their spectral hands cold as winter's breath. His talisman glowed faintly, a fragile beacon against the encroaching shadows. He gripped it tightly, chanting louder, summoning every ounce of resolve. The roots recoiled, but only momentarily. Then, from the depths of the pit, a voice echoed, a child's, laced with anguish. "You can't undo what was done. The roots have taken too much." Elijah's heart thundered as he realized the truth. This was not just a battle for survival, but a reckoning with the sins of those long gone. The ritual was incomplete, the price unpaid. As the forest closed in, Elijah's vision blurred, and the line between nightmare and reality dissolved. The roots whispered promises of oblivion, but amidst the darkness, a spark of defiance ignited within him. He would fight, not just for himself, but for Fairvale, for the souls trapped beneath the roots. But at what cost? The forest watched silently, as it always did, waiting for the next move in a game older than memory. Elijah stumbled back from the tangled mass of roots that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, their dark tendrils recoiling only to surge again, like the breath of the forest itself. His breath came ragged, the cold night air biting deep into his lungs, but retreat was impossible. There was no escaping the grip of Fairvale's ancient curse. He steadied himself, eyes fixed on the faint glow of his makeshift talisman. It flickered weakly, struggling against the oppressive darkness that clawed at his senses. The forest whispered around him, soft murmurs at first, then growing into a cacophony of sorrowful voices, desperate pleas and venomous threats. He could almost see the faces in the shadows. Children lost, villagers long vanished, all trapped beneath the suffocating roots. His mind flashed back to the journal, its brittle pages worn from decades, filled with cryptic symbols and half-remembered rites. The words spoke of an ancient pact, a desperate bargain made by the settlers to bind the forest's rage. But such magic came with a price, one paid in blood and souls. Elijah's fingers trembled as he traced the circle etched into the earth, hastily redrawn from the faded manuscript. He could feel the power crackling in the air, a volatile force eager to tear free. The forest didn't merely protect itself, it hungered for vengeance, a reckoning long overdue. As he began the incantation again, the wind shifted abruptly. A chilling presence settled over the clearing, and from the shadows emerged a figure, tall, cloaked in tattered robes, its face obscured by darkness. Elijah's heart pounded violently. The figure moved with unnatural grace, an aura of malevolence radiating from it like poison. "You cannot undo the binding," the voice hissed, hollow and echoing as if spoken from beyond the grave. "The roots remember. They consume, and soon, so will you." Fear threatened to overwhelm Elijah, but he forced himself to stand firm. "I'm not afraid," he replied, voice steady though his body betrayed him. The figure laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling on a forgotten grave. "Brave words for one so fleeting. This land is cursed, and its hunger is endless." Suddenly, the ground beneath Elijah's feet trembled again. The roots writhed violently, bursting upward with terrible force. From the earth emerged skeletal hands, clawing and grasping, desperate to drag him into the soil's dark embrace. Elijah dodged frantically, barely escaping their grasp. He could feel the cold touch of death itself as the hands grazed his skin. Panic surged, but he fought to keep his focus, chanting louder, invoking the ancient rites with every ounce of strength. The talisman blazed brightly now, casting long shadows that seemed to push back the darkness. The malevolent figure recoiled, shrieking in fury. The roots writhed and convulsed, fighting against the light. Then, in a sudden, horrifying moment, the ground gave way beneath Elijah. He plunged downward, the world spinning into chaos. He landed hard in a cold, damp chamber beneath the forest floor. Around him, the walls were lined with twisted roots pulsing faintly with a sickly light. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, suffocating and ancient. Voices echoed, whispers of the lost, pleading for release, warning of the price yet to be paid. Elijah's heart hammered in his chest. He knew this was no ordinary place. It was the heart of the curse, the source of the forest's insatiable hunger. Suddenly, a chilling realization dawned on him. The roots were not just a trap, they were a prison. A prison for something far worse than any legend could describe. As he groped through the darkness, searching for a way out, a faint glow caught his eye. It was a small wooden box, carved with the same symbols from the journal, resting on a pedestal of gnarled roots. With trembling hands, Elijah opened the box. Inside lay a single, ancient key, heavy and cold, inscribed with runes that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly light. Before he could react, a cold breeze swept through the chamber, carrying a whisper that chilled him to the bone. "Use it wisely, or doom us all." A shadow moved just beyond the edge of the glow, something watching, waiting. Elijah's breath hitched as the chamber began to quake again. The roots pulsed faster, the walls closing in. He clutched the key tightly. And then, from the darkness, a voice called out his name. The night swallowed Fairvale whole, a suffocating blanket of silence pressing down on the town like a shroud. No wind stirred the skeletal trees, no owl called out across the empty fields. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dreadful to unfold. Elijah's footsteps echoed on the cracked pavement as he made his way toward the edge of town, the old railway station looming like a forgotten sentinel beneath the pale moonlight. His mind raced, haunted by the memory of the underground chamber and the ancient key now burning a cold weight in his pocket. He paused to gather his step, turning to stare into the empty halls. Every instinct screamed that he was walking deeper into the heart of the curse, into the lair where the forest's hunger festered strongest. He paused at the threshold of the station, eyes scanning the derelict platform scattered with broken glass and rusted tracks. The air tasted of damp earth and decay, and from the shadows came the faintest whisper, half-caught words tangled with desperation and warning. He swallowed hard, tightening his grip on the talisman that glimmered faintly against his chest. Its light a fragile beacon in the oppressive dark. Elijah's mind flicked back to the journal's cryptic warnings, the stories of settlers who vanished without a trace, their fates sealed by rituals performed long ago beneath the roots of the cursed forest. The binding spell was not just a ward. It was a prison for something ancient and malevolent, a creature bound by blood and bone, but forever hungry. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft rustling behind him. Spinning around, he caught sight of Miriam, her eyes wide with fear yet blazing with determination. She had followed him, refusing to let him face the darkness alone. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, voice trembling. "They say no one leaves the forest edge once the moon turns red." "I have to," Elijah replied, voice low but steady. "There's more at stake than just me. This curse, it's spreading. If I don't end it now, it'll consume everything." Miriam nodded, pulling her coat tighter around her slender frame. "Then we do it together." Together, they stepped into the station's shadowed interior, where the air grew thick and cold, as if the building itself exhaled a breath of ancient sorrow. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the faint glow from Elijah's talisman danced along the peeling walls, revealing faded posters of long-forgotten train schedules and warnings about trespassing. At the far end of the platform lay the rusted entrance to the old maintenance tunnels, narrow, twisting passages that vanished beneath the earth. Elijah's fingers brushed the key in his pocket, its runes pulsing softly in rhythm with his heartbeat. This was the gateway the journals spoke of, the threshold between the cursed land above and the realm where the forest's hunger roamed free. Steeling himself, he pushed open the heavy iron door, its hinges groaning in protest. A rush of cold air escaped, carrying with it the faintest scent of rot and something far older, an ancient malevolence that slithered unseen. The tunnel swallowed them whole. The walls closed in around Elijah and Miriam as they descended into darkness, the air growing heavier with each step. Their flashlights barely pierced the black, revealing twisted roots that clawed from the ceiling and walls like skeletal fingers reaching for escape. Somewhere deep below, the forest's heartbeat pulsed, a slow, menacing thrum that vibrated through the stone. Suddenly, a distant sound echoed, a child's laughter, soft and eerie, drifting through the tunnels like a cruel mockery. Elijah froze, every nerve on edge. "It's here," he whispered. "The curse, it's alive." Miriam reached out, gripping his arm. "We have to keep moving. Whatever it is, it's watching." They pressed on, deeper into the labyrinth, following the winding passages until they reached a cavernous chamber. The walls here were etched with ancient symbols, glowing faintly with a spectral light. In the center stood a stone altar, slick with dark stains that spoke of sacrifices long past. Elijah stepped forward, the key glowing fiercely now in his palm. He could feel the weight of generations pressing down on him, the hopes and fears of those who had tried and failed to break the curse. As he inserted the key into a concealed lock beneath the altar, the ground trembled violently. The roots above groaned, their grip tightening around the earth as a shadow began to coalesce in the chamber's center, a twisted, monstrous form made of bark, bone, and the wailing souls trapped within. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. This was the heart of the curse, the ancient entity that had bound Fairvale in darkness for centuries. Its eyes blazed with unnatural fire as it stepped forward, voice like grinding stone. "You seek to undo what was forged in blood. But every binding demands a price." Miriam raised her talisman, its light flaring defiantly against the encroaching shadow. "Then we'll pay that price. We'll end this nightmare." The creature lunged, and the chamber exploded in a clash of light and shadow, power and desperation. Elijah felt the forest's hunger gnawing at his soul, threatening to consume him whole, but he held firm, chanting the ancient rites as his voice rang through the chamber. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the boundaries between life and death blurring. The creature's roar echoed through the tunnels as roots writhed and shattered, and with a final, blinding flash, the shadow dissolved into nothingness. Exhausted, Elijah collapsed to his knees. The oppressive weight lifted, the air clearing like a storm breaking. For the first time in centuries, the forest was silent. But as he looked up, Miriam's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Behind them, in the tunnel's fading shadows, two gleaming eyes watched, cold, unblinking, and hungry. The curse was not over. The air in the abandoned cabin grew colder as Elijah and Miriam tried to catch their breath. The weight of the battle beneath the old station still pressed heavily on their minds. Outside, the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting long shadows through the broken windows and tangled vines that crept up the walls. Yet the creeping sense of dread refused to lift, as if the forest itself exhaled a warning, cold and unyielding. Elijah rubbed the grime from his face, his hands trembling slightly. The key's glow had dimmed but was still warm against his skin, a reminder of the lingering connection to the ancient curse. "We stopped it. At least for now," he murmured, eyes flickering to Miriam, whose gaze was fixed on the dense woods beyond the clearing. "But for how long?" Miriam's voice was soft, almost breaking. "This isn't over. You saw what it was, more than just a creature. It's tied to this land, to every shadow in those trees." Elijah nodded, knowing she was right. The forest was a living thing, older than any of them, and it didn't forgive easily. The journal hinted at a cycle, a repeating curse that demands sacrifice. Miriam's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're running out of time." Suddenly, a sharp noise snapped through the silence, twigs snapping beneath heavy footsteps. Both spun toward the door, tension coiling in their chests like a venomous snake. "Who's there?" Elijah called out, his voice steady but wary. A figure emerged from the trees, a man, rugged and unshaven, eyes wild yet filled with urgent knowledge. "You don't belong here," he said, voice low, warning like the forest's own breath. "This place, this curse, it's not something to be meddled with lightly." Miriam stepped forward, protective. "We've come to end it, to stop the suffering." The stranger laughed, bitter and hollow. "Ending it? You don't understand. I've lived with this burden my whole life. My family, generations lost to the hunger beneath these roots. The forest doesn't want peace, it wants blood." Elijah's fingers tightened around the talisman. "Then, help us. Teach us what we need to know." The man's eyes flickered with pain. "There's a ritual, older than the first settlers, older than the soil itself. To truly end the curse, a price must be paid, not just by you, but by those you love." The room seemed to grow colder still. Miriam's breath caught. "What kind of price?" The stranger looked away, voice dropping to a whisper. "The curse demands a guardian, a soul bound to the forest, forever. Without one to hold it at bay, the darkness spreads." Elijah's heart pounded. The weight of the revelation was crushing. "So someone has to stay, trapped, forever? Or it consumes everything." The man's eyes locked with Elijah's, desperate. "And you're the only one who can choose." A heavy silence settled between them, thick with the enormity of their situation. Outside, the forest rustled ominously, as if awaiting their decision. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream tore through the air, a sound so raw and desperate it shook the very walls. Miriam gasped, clutching Elijah's arm. "It's happening again. The hunger, it's coming." They rushed outside, the stranger following close behind. The sky was darkening despite the dawn, shadows lengthening unnaturally. From the edge of the woods, glowing eyes watched, countless and merciless. Elijah raised the talisman, its light flaring defiantly against the encroaching darkness. "We fight. We finish this, or we die trying." The forest answered with a low growl, the ground trembling beneath their feet. As they braced themselves for the coming storm, Elijah's thoughts turned cold and sharp. Was he ready to make the ultimate sacrifice? The choice loomed like a razor's edge, and the forest waited patiently for its due. Then, through the dark, a whisper, a voice not quite human, called his name, and in that moment, Elijah knew. The true battle was only just beginning. The wind howled through the skeletal trees like a mournful lament, carrying with it the scent of decay and forgotten secrets. Elijah stood at the edge of the forest's darkest heart, the weight of countless souls pressing down on him like a suffocating shroud. The talisman glowed faintly in his hand, its light barely holding back the engulfing shadows. This was the final confrontation, the moment where everything would be decided. He took a slow, steadying breath. The memories of all he had lost, the friends, the betrayals, the chilling revelations, pressed upon him like cold stones in his chest. The forest was no longer just a place, it was a living nightmare, an ancient force that had woven itself into the very fabric of his fate, and now it demanded its due. From the gloom emerged Miriam, her eyes weary but fierce. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, the tremor in her voice betraying the calm she tried to project. Elijah nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at his resolve. "I don't have a choice." Together they stepped forward, deeper into the thicket, where the darkness thickened and the air grew colder. The ground beneath them pulsed faintly, as if the earth itself breathed with a malignant life. Shapes shifted in the shadows, whispers of those lost, half-seen figures that danced on the edge of perception. As they reached a clearing, the full horror of the curse revealed itself. Twisted roots coiled like serpents around a stone altar, stained dark with age-old blood. The air vibrated with a terrible energy, a ritual waiting to be completed. Elijah felt the talisman's warmth surge. This was the point of no return. Suddenly, a figure stepped out from behind the altar, the stranger who had warned them, now revealed as the last guardian of the curse's secret. His eyes burned with desperation and something far older, resignation. "You must understand," the man said, voice thick with sorrow. "This curse is a cycle. To break it, a guardian must be bound to the forest, taking its pain and hunger upon themselves. It is a sacrifice few can bear." Elijah's heart pounded. "And if I refuse?" The man's gaze darkened. "Then the forest will consume everything. Every living thing nearby will fall into shadow. The hunger is endless." Miriam stepped beside Elijah, hand trembling slightly as she gripped his arm. "There has to be another way." "There isn't," the stranger replied, voice steady but heavy. "It has always been this way." Elijah looked around the clearing, the twisted roots, the silent faces watching from the trees, the weight of generations of suffering, and felt the crushing inevitability. He was at a crossroads between sacrifice and survival, between hope and despair. As he approached the altar, the talisman pulsed fiercely, casting flickering light over the carvings, ancient symbols that told stories of pain, loss, and endless vision. The air thickened, voices rising in a ghostly chorus calling for release. In that moment, Elijah understood the true horror. The curse was not just about death or darkness. It was about eternal burden, a never-ending chain of sacrifice, binding souls to the forest's insatiable will. He knelt before the altar, placing the talisman on the stone surface. A cold wind swept through the clearing, and the forest seemed to lean in, waiting. Miriam's voice broke through the silence, filled with quiet anguish. "You don't have to do this alone." Elijah looked up, eyes shining with fierce determination, tempered by sorrow. "No one ever is." As the ritual began, the ground trembled, roots writhing like living things, pulling at Elijah's very soul. Pain and power intertwined, a terrible communion of flesh and spirit. The light from the talisman blazed, then dimmed to a soft glow as the shadows receded. When the tremors ceased, Elijah lay still, his body transformed but his spirit vigilant. The forest was silent once more, but the price had been paid, and the curse, for now, was contained. Yet deep within, a whisper echoed, faint but persistent, a reminder that darkness never truly dies. Elijah's eyes fluttered open to the dim light filtering through the dense canopy above. His body felt heavier, like it belonged to someone else, yet the sharpness of his senses had never been clearer. The forest was quiet now, an eerie silence that pressed against his skin, waiting. Miriam sat beside him, her face pale but resolute. She reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "You did it," she whispered. "You're alive." Elijah tried to nod but found his limbs sluggish, bound by a new, strange energy coursing beneath his skin. The talisman had fused with him, its power no longer external, but a part of his very being. He was no longer just a man. He was a guardian, tethered to the ancient curse that gripped this land. "We need to leave," Elijah said hoarsely, voice rough with disuse. Miriam's eyes flickered with hesitation. The forest? It's changed since you took the burden. The whispers are different. The shadows don't move the same way. He understood. The curse was not just a curse anymore. It was now intertwined with him. Wherever he went, the forest would reach out, pulling at his mind, his soul. They made their way back through the undergrowth, the familiar path now twisted and alien. The trees seemed to lean closer, their branches like fingers brushing against Elijah's skin. Every step felt like a negotiation, a balance between his fading humanity and the creeping otherness. At the edge of the woods, the first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft hues, but the town of Hollow Creek was not as welcoming as the sunrise suggested. Windows were shuttered, doors barred, and an unnatural hush hung heavy over the streets. Elijah and Miriam paused, sensing the community's unease. Rumors had spread, fueled by fear and suspicion. Stories of disappearances, strange sightings, and the thickening darkness in the forest had made the townsfolk wary, even hostile. They approached the sheriff's office, hoping to find answers, or at least allies. Sheriff Daniels, a grizzled man with lines etched deep by years of hardship, regarded them with a mixture of suspicion and relief. "Elijah," he greeted cautiously, "we heard what happened out there. The forest's curse, it's not just old stories anymore, is it?" Elijah shook his head, the weight of his new reality settling heavy. "It's real, and I'm bound to it now. The forest chose me." The sheriff's eyes darkened. "That explains the disappearances and the shadows creeping closer each night. What can we do?" Elijah met his gaze steadily. "We prepare. This is just the beginning. The forest won't rest, and neither can we." Miriam interjected, voice firm despite the fear underlying her words. "There's a ritual, old and nearly forgotten, that might sever the forest's hold, but it comes at a terrible cost." The sheriff scoffed. "Cost? Around here? Cost usually means more blood spilled, but if it's our only chance..." The conversation was cut short by a sudden, bone-chilling howl echoing through the valley. A sound that wasn't entirely animal, nor fully human. The hairs on Elijah's neck rose as the forest seemed to respond, a dark pulse rippling through the air. "We don't have much time," Elijah said grimly. "The curse is waking." That night, as the town lay cloaked in uneasy silence, Elijah sat alone on the porch of the sheriff's station, the talisman cold and heavy in his hand. Memories of the ritual flooded his mind, the sacrifice, the searing pain, the faces of those lost to the forest's hunger. A whisper stirred the leaves beyond the porch light, soft yet insistent. Elijah's breath caught as a figure materialized from the shadows, no longer fully human, yet not entirely spirit. The guardian of the forest's ancient secret had returned, bound to Elijah's fate. "Your sacrifice has only tethered you deeper," the apparition murmured. "The cycle is unbroken." Elijah's heart pounded. The forest was not done with him, and the true battle was yet to come. As the figure dissolved into the night, Elijah knew that surviving the curse was only the beginning. Somewhere in the darkness, the forest's hunger still lurked, waiting, watching, and ready to reclaim what it believed was its own. The wind rose again, carrying with it a sound that was not a howl, but a chorus. Echoes of the lost, calling out from the depths. And Elijah understood with chilling clarity, this was far from over. Thank you so much for joining me on this chilling journey through the shadows of Hollow Creek. I hope this story gave you that spine-tingling thrill and kept you on the edge of your seat. If you enjoyed the deep dive into folklore, rituals, and the eerie unknown lurking just beyond the light, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more horror stories that explore the darkest corners of American legends and supernatural mysteries. Your support means the world and helps keep these stories alive, bringing a little fear and fascination into our everyday lives. Remember, sometimes the scariest things aren't just in the story. They might be closer than you think. Stay curious, stay cautious, and most importantly, stay safe out there. Until next time, keep the lights on and keep listening.